do you use?
Spoilers.
Spoilers. Spoilers. Spoilers. Spoilers. Spoilers. I like that word.
I thought you might.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Missing Presumed Lost, and today we'll be looking at the slightly controversial but somewhat misunderstood story of The Savages. Now, I have a bit of a confession to make. Whilst I have seen all of the missing Doctor Who stories via Telesnap reconstructions at least once, The Savages is one of those ones that's always really struggled to hold my attention. And so, apart from watching it for this review, I think I have only really seen it the once. And combining that with its lack of visuals, with all 4 episodes being missing from the BBC archives, I think it is one of those stories that I more listened to rather than watched. But maybe that's where I went wrong. As with other stills reconstructions, the action on screen is often displayed through scrolling captions that you have to read, which does remove a lot of the immersion and tension, but once you look past that, it's actually quite a compelling story. Whilst the base narrative of The Savages is nothing particularly special in the grand schemes of Doctor Who, the overall story narrative is something a bit more unique. Even though it's an obviously futuristic story, the Savages part of the narrative gives it a bit more of a historic feel, with the warring tribe side of the narrative feeling more akin to something like An Unearthly Child. But with the inclusion of more obvious sci-fi elements, such as light guns, futuristic machinery, and an advanced city, it has more of a ring to it of the Daleks, which is an interesting note as they do get a mention in this story.
Just in the same way that I oppose the Daleks or any other menace to common humanity.
So, in a way, it could be said it's more akin to both of those stories being combined and retold as one. However, the main area where The Savages differs from both of those stories is its much more happier ending, the more stronger moral tale it carries, and the redemption of the villain who becomes good after seeing his actions from another perspective. That is not to say this story is without its issues, however. At the start of this review, I did mention this story's controversial nature, but we're going to come back to that later in the review. But the one thing that does feel off about this story is Steven's departure. With the character's decision to stay behind and help heal the rifts on both sides, it does fit into more of the happier ending, but it kind of comes out of nowhere. But there is a reason for that. This is a story, once again, which doesn't have a single good piece of trivia to focus on, so I'm going to give you several different ones, starting with someone I mentioned in the last segment. The reason for Steven's departure in the story, and the rather sudden feel to it, is because it wasn't wholly untrue of the same being said behind the scenes. Purv's departure from the series was not of his own accord. It was simply because his contract wasn't renewed, a move which infuriated William Hartnell, who had grown very close with Peter Purves and formed a great friendship with him over the years. This is actually the first story to feature no deaths of additional cast members. Whilst many people say it is the Edge of Destruction which holds that title, that is technically not correct, as the Edge of Destruction has no additional characters other than the TARDIS team themselves. And lastly, The Savages is the first Doctor Who story to have one singular title, with each episode being introduced as a number rather than its own subtitle. The next piece of trivia I wanted to make into a lesson learned, as it does tread on very delicate ground. The original title of the story was to be The White Savages, and the original and very controversial plan would have been for the elder race to have been portrayed by actors in blackface, intending to make the story a parable of apartheid-era South Africa. However, this was later dropped with the exception of the character Jano. Whilst the inclusion of just one actor in blackface is troubling alone, it is worth remembering that this story, like many other things, was a product of its time when this was considered acceptable, and thankfully the majority of the previously mentioned elements were not included in the story. However, in doing my research for this review, I came across an article that has a more in-depth look into this story by academic and writer Fiona Moore. I have linked it in the description for those interested, and I would thoroughly recommend reading it through before you judge this story based on the little that I have just said. She raises some very valid points about the intentions, issues, and impact of this story, and also helps dispel some of the myths surrounding this story, especially for those who may have read about it but not actually seen it. It's fair to say that we currently live in a world where people will jump to conclusions based on initial interpretation and incomplete information. But if anything should be known about this story from the start, it's that its overall moral can be paraphrased and summed up in quotes from the final episode. That whilst the fear and hatred of the past may take a long time to leave us, by finding common ground over time we will become one people and learn to live together without bitterness. Whilst there are certainly stories I would like to see animated before The Savages, and given everything I have just said, I can understand why it might be a slightly controversial story to animate, it is certainly one that I would rather see sooner than later. Not only could an animated version realise the story in full whilst removing some of the more controversial visual element, shall we say, but its overall narrative and moral conclusion is one that is still as relevant today as it was when it's first aired, and would no doubt be relevant for many future generations to come. At this point, I'm inclined to say I would highly recommend The Savages, as when you actually sit down and pay attention to watch it, it is a story which draws you in. However, as it can't be ignored that with all 4 episodes missing and only stills reconstructions existing, it is one of those stories that you really do have to pay attention to, as very little happens quite literally on screen, and you might find yourself getting easily distracted. So for now, I would say it is one of those stories you probably could skip over without missing too much. But if it ever does get an animated reconstruction, then I cannot recommend it highly enough. But that brings to a close another Missing Presumed Lost. As always, I hope you all enjoyed this video. Like, favorite, subscribe, share, it really helps me out a lot. I'll be sure to description below for a link to my Patreon. I'm doing my very first figure animation and you can get involved. There's exclusive content and rewards for those who do so, and funding my Patreon in any way gets your name at the end of my videos. I salute you all, and I will see you with another video very soon.